American democracy is under threat, and we all need to work together to protect the country and to protect our democracy. It's kind of like in World War II, when everyone was expected to play a role. And the first part of this is for all of us to learn a little more and to work together, strengthening American democracy, strengthening the country. The Civic Life series is a big part of that, and the 92nd Street Y, New York, is the right forum for delivering all that. I appreciate your joining me. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Barron-Lopez. I'm White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, and I am joined here today by Max Stier, CEO of the Partnership for Public Service, as well as Ellen Fitzpatrick, professor of history emerita at the University of New Hampshire. And today we're going to be talking about the first 100 days of the presidency. What does it mean to govern early on in a presidency? How definitive are the first 100 days of a new administration? And we're going to be talking about the priorities with the incoming administration of President-elect Donald Trump, as well as the relationship with Congress, the public, and the world. So we're going to dive into policies, strategies, and real-world impacts of the new administration and what past first 100 days could tell us about this incoming administration. So I'd like us to get started first with you, Professor Fitzpatrick. If you could give us a little bit of a history lesson when it comes to the first 100 days and how they became a benchmark and something that the American public paid attention to.
They became a benchmark during the 1930s in the midst of the Great Depression, when Franklin Roosevelt won the election of 1932, really by a landslide with record majorities in both houses. The United States was in the depth of the Great Depression at that time, with extraordinarily high unemployment. The economy really was collapsing, and there was widespread national frustration with the Hoover administration and its perceived lack of action. And when he accepted the Democratic nomination, Franklin Roosevelt memorably said that he promised a new deal for the American people. That phrase, the first 100 days, was invoked by Roosevelt himself in the summer of 1933, when the 100 days of his administration had passed. And he referred to the fact that he had used the first 100 days to set the machinery of the New Deal he had promised in motion. And he certainly did. It was a period of extraordinary legislative activism led by Roosevelt and his administration, in which over 75 pieces of legislation were passed by the Congress, and 15 of those bills were major pieces of legislation that really transformed the relationship between the federal government and planning for society and economy. The focus was on providing relief to the American people and also recovery and bringing the federal government into regulating and helping to plan for the American economy. So it was an extraordinary period of accomplishment, and every single president since has had this albatross hung around their neck. What did you do during your first 100 days? The circumstances were unique to the 30s, so it's unfair in that sense that other presidents have had to be measured by that standard, but it's stuck, and it's every year, certainly that we have the transition, a big media story, and presidents have subsequently become more mindful of having something to show for those first 100 days.
That's right. And President Biden, the outgoing president, was very mindful of those first 100 days, often drawing some comparisons to FDR with attempting to bring the country out of the COVID-19 pandemic and into a recovery. But Max, Professor Fitzpatrick said 15 major pieces of legislation from Roosevelt. I'm a little skeptical that there will be 15 big pieces of legislation with this incoming administration and the Congress, given how narrow the margins are in Congress. But what are you looking for in these first 100 days?
So I love the history lesson here, and as you suggest, I think it is a different world. It's would be extraordinary, and then some, if the new administration was able to even get anywhere close to the legislative productivity that we just heard occurred in 1932. And I think the alternative approach that recent presidents have chosen, and that it appears that incoming President Trump will pursue, is trying to create the same kind of energy through executive orders. And the reality is that executive orders oftentimes, in my view, are more show than substance. They may designate the direction the administration is going in, but they certainly don't carry with them the same kind of fundamental change that legislation can, or even oftentimes the implementation requirements that those executive orders actually require are not often aligned with the executive orders that are done. So in today's world, I think the most important things for us to be focused on is not just what happens on day one, or frankly within the first 100 days, but what does the larger team look like that incoming President Trump will have? How quickly does he get them in place? The machinery of government now is not just the difficulty of moving legislation, but it's also of getting your leadership in place across the various agencies, some of which were created during the Roosevelt era. So number one would be who's actually confirmed and how quickly are they confirmed? How quickly do they get the larger team in place around those folks? So much is focused attention on the White House, but it's actually in the various agencies that most of the work of government actually takes place. So part one would be getting that team in place. Part two is actually having them work effectively together, creating a rhythm of activity by that leadership group. And then part three would be how far do they follow through on the myriad of executive orders that are likely to come through on day one. We've seen this not just in the prior Trump administration, but in many other administrations. Lots of big ideas about what administrations want to accomplish. The world often interferes with the ability to actually pursue that forward agenda. And oftentimes there's not sufficient attention paid to, again, that execution capability, making sure that what you say you want done actually gets done. So how you perform in that first 100 day sets that agenda, but it's the follow through that will matter the most.
And with the team, other than Matt Gaetz, who withdrew from being Donald Trump's attorney general nominee, right now it's looking as though his nominees could very well, a majority of them could very well end up getting confirmed by the Senate. There's hearings happening very soon. But Max, you've talked a lot about background checks and just the different types of disclosures and documents that these nominees have to go through. And where is that at? And have Trump's nominees handled that differently than prior nominees?
So the process does matter a great deal, and this is in many ways a different transition cycle. President-elect Trump's transition effort was very slow in engaging with the governmental entities that are needed to enable a effective handoff of power, and that includes to this day no agreement with the General Services Administration, which was sort of the front end of the transition process. As you note, in terms of being able to confirm your nominees, the Senate has always required, before moving forward with anybody, critical information that was provided by the FBI and the background check that they do for every Senate confirmed position, but also sign off from the Office of Government Ethics, which looks at the financial holdings of all the nominees to make sure that there is some plan of action that will enable an individual to perform their public duties without creating a conflict of interest, personal conflict, a financial interest with their holdings or the holdings of those that are immediately around them. And in this cycle, again, President-elect Trump's team has been slow in getting those background checks started, engaging with the Office of Government Ethics. And we're seeing some of that play out in the Senate today, where those hearings have been slow in coming or slower in coming because that vital information is not there. One very real open question right now is how much the Senate will put those nominees to the test. And there's an effort to push through those nominations, even without all the information that has always been required historically. And I think there is a real power struggle taking place right now in terms of the appropriate role of the Senate in making sure that they fulfill their constitutional responsibility of checking all these nominees, the advise and consent role that they actually play. But, early days right now, I would say that there are challenges for many of the nominees. And in part, it's because many of those nominees are actually people who are non-traditional in their selection. It appears to be a focus primarily on loyalty over the competency and character issues that are, usually dominant for these most senior positions.
Ellen, when you look at Donald Trump's potential first 100 days and the fact that he has promised a lot of executive actions, one specifically around deportations, around immigration, but also potentially tariffs, not just on adversaries, but he's threatened some on allies like Canada and Greenland and Mexico. When you see what he has forecasted so far, what stands out to you, and how predictive are these first 100 days for the rest of his administration?
That's a complex and two-part question. So I want to take the first part and also respond a little bit to what Max just said about the executive orders, because of course Roosevelt used them as well. He closed the banks. It was one of his very first actions, so that he could then move ahead with stabilizing the banking system and reopening the banks and making sure that they were safe and could tell the American people it's okay to put your money back in the bank and stop the hoarding of money. He took the United States off the gold standard. These were dramatic actions. In recent years, we've had the situation where the executive orders of one administration are quickly repealed. Among the first actions of the new president are repealing executive orders made by the prior administration. And so we saw that in the first Trump administration. We saw it when President Biden became president. So there's an undoing of sometimes the immediate action is to undo the actions of the predecessor. And that, of course, reflects the kinds of divisions that exist in the body politic today. In terms of President Trump, he passed no major legislation in his first 100 days in his first term in office. And as I was reviewing the promises that he made that of what he would do in his first 100 days of his first administration, he promised to build the wall within the first 100 days, to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, to deport immigrants, and to remove restrictions on energy production. Those promises will sound very familiar to people that followed the recent election. So he's coming into his new administration making many of these same promises. And so how predictive are the promises of what will follow? Not very. These are very hard things to do. And once he's much more experienced, of course, coming into his second administration, and undoubtedly is determined not to make whatever mistakes he feels he made the first time around. But I think that the promises going into an administration are not, first of all, they're very hard to realize in our current political climate with the very narrow margins that the presidents are coming into office with, and the difficulties on the Hill and getting bills passed. In addition to that, I think Mistakes in the first 100 days certainly are not definitive. They don't predict a failed administration, nor do successes. Ronald Reagan came into the White House with having the hostages in Iran, the American hostages that had been held, freed moments after he was sworn into office on his inauguration day. So this was the thing that brought the Carter administration down, or certainly helped to, he was free from immediately. And this was a great boon, a great lifting of the spirits. By the end of his administration, he was embroiled in the Iran-Contra scandal. So Iran hardly disappeared from the radar screen for President Reagan. Similarly, John F. Kennedy had a disastrous foreign policy debacle with the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a failure, the attempt to invade Cuba. And it was a very sobering experience. And he felt extremely discouraged by this event and felt that he was going to have a failed presidency in that moment. And of course, soon found out, to his amazement, that his approval ratings actually improved immediately after this. He had the highest approval ratings of any president in modern American history throughout his administration. And they went up 11 points after the Bay of Pigs invasion, from like 82%, 73% approval to higher in the 80s approval. So, and of course, was very sobered by what he learned from that experience that helped him during the Cuban Missile Crisis to have more skepticism about the assurances of his military brass that don't worry about it, it's going to work, which he had been told during the Bay of Pigs and about the Bay of Pigs invasion. So I don't think they're terribly predictive, either in the promises made, the promises kept, or what it will say about what will follow.
Max, Ellen is saying that the promises made for the first 100 days are not necessarily predictive of what will even happen within the first 100 days or after the first 100 days. When you're looking at some of the decisions the incoming president has made that potentially raise conflicts of interest, first I want to ask you about Elon Musk, a billionaire who is set to co-run this new Department of Government Efficiency. Do you see a conflict of interest there, given that Musk has a number of contracts across the government existing already with his businesses? And what other potential conflicts of interest do you see with the team that Trump is bringing in?
So I love the historical examples that Ellen provides, and I think they're important context. I also think, and your question suggests this, that we're looking at a very different kind of presidency than the ones that were illustrated by her. And in particular, it's worth reminding all of ourselves that it isn't a new president. It's a president, again, who has been around the track one time before. I think one of the important observations that I've seen is that that there's not often sort of broad learning that takes place or did not take place in his first administration. As you saw with President Kennedy when he came in, you have a president who's very much, I think, set in his approach and his ways and his understanding, and in many instances tries to change the world rather than change himself in terms of trying to create different outcomes from the behavior that he has. And I think what you're describing on the question of conflicts of interest is an example of just this very phenomenon. You saw many examples in the first administration, Trump administration, that appear to be taken to a much higher degree in this administration, in bringing in people who have very, very large individual wealth and complicated portfolios that are integrated with our economy, that are being put in positions where they will have influence on things that have real impact on their own personal wealth. When you deal with the people that are directly in government, there are a set of established rules and processes, a criminal statute that applies to them, and if they engage in activity that creates a conflict, It gets a lot more complicated, as you've just outlined, when you bring in somebody from the outside who's not taking a position in government and who is trying to avoid any adoption of what is called special government employee status that would make those rules apply to people even if they were outside of government. So this question about where the line is drawn in terms of who must meet these conflict of interest requirements is a very important one. I think that the concept of trying to reform our government is a very strong one. How it's done is more important than anything else, and making sure that the people who are ultimately responsible and taking the charge for the public good are in fact representing the public good rather than their own private interests is a fundamental responsibility, not only of those individuals, but of President Trump himself. And I think right now we face many, many, many questions that are going to be very important for folks like yourself and the media to be exploring. We don't have the answers yet, and it is going to be vital for us to check those issues and concerns. This is a very difficult, complicated world, and you want to make sure that people who have great capacity, even if they have individual wealth, can continue to serve. But it is, I think, likewise essential that the processes are respected that are in place to make sure that those individuals are in fact looking out for the public good rather than their own private interest.
One of the big changes that the incoming president wants to make to government is changing and essentially gutting the current civil service. So changing their status and making it so he can appoint more political appointees across all of the agencies in government, because he wants people in place who are going to be loyalists, who will listen to him, who will carry out his agenda as he wants it done. And Ellen, to you first, I want to ask you, do you see any historical parallels, past presidents who attempted to do this or attempted to do the opposite of what Donald Trump is promising he wants to do to the civil service?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a back to the future situation here, where the great reforms of the progressive era, the late 19th and 20th, early 20th century, were to root out this kind of cronyism and corruption. It wasn't entirely successful, obviously, but the emphasis on good government and attempting to distinguish between using political office and political power for private gain was what the progressives of the late 19th and early 20th century were focused on trying to address. And I think that Max's point, I'm playing the role of historian here rather than commentator, so I'm checking my own views here to some extent, to say that I would say the contempt that President Trump has shown for the norms of the normal presidential leadership and the tone of that most presidents have attempted to adopt, of focusing really on not magnifying conflicts among citizens and various groups in our country, that the historical precedents are not terribly useful when you're looking at a president-elect who we learned from his first term in office was really sui generis in many ways in terms of his approach to these things. So I think that this is, one might be reminded of a new Gilded Age here, which was what the progressive reforms were a reaction to, the feeling that the new industrial titans, the corporate powers that had come to rise with the growth of American capitalism in the late 19th century had overweening control and were mastering the institutions of government in the service of their own wealth, and that average people were suffering from that. So there has been, I think, historically a long suspicion among the American public of this kind of corporate influence and power. On the other hand, there's some attraction to figures who have boasted that they will use these levers of power to try to transform what is occurring in the nation at that moment in time. And so the promises that President Trump has made in this last campaign obviously had some appeal to Americans who were looking to see these changes made. And whether he can deliver on them remains to be seen. But I think we may see some very dramatic events right away in terms of immigration. There's every indication that that may occur. How the public will respond once this all gets underway remains to be seen. I would say, though, Laura, that every president, many of them have come to office in moments of terrible conflict and great disruption in the nation itself. Look at Abraham Lincoln, who between his election and his inauguration, the southern states began seceding from the Union and forming the Confederacy. And within a month of his taking office, the Civil War began. So this is not something that he had hoped to see happen, but it was something that then took place.
Right. We have no knowing what the country, what kind of events could overtake the country after the president-elect takes office. But Max, I also wanted to ask you about this action that we're talking about, that Ellen was just talking about, this executive action that Donald Trump has said that he will institute, known as Schedule F, and that's to allow him to put more political appointees across all of the government agencies. Do you have concerns about this executive action, and what impact do you think it could have if he's able to execute it?
Yes, and so the quick answer is yes, very, very large concerns. And to pull on the string that Ellen started around the historical example that you asked about earlier, we have been down this road before. It is Back to the Future. As you heard in the 19th century, you had a spoils system, and that fundamentally was about a president who was able to fill the ranks of the civil service or the federal government with people who were loyalists as opposed to people who were merit-based, apolitical. And we had a president assassinated, President Garfield, and that was really the precipitating event to move our system away from that spoils system and to one that was focused on capability and merit as being the primary reasons to hire and also to fire people if those were absent. So President Trump, I think, though, is really has laid out an approach to fundamentally change the construct of our government. Certainly that is true with respect to our civil service, but it's also true in the nature of the political appointees that he's making right now, who are, again, largely chosen on the basis of their willingness to be loyal to him, as opposed to their own experiences and qualities that would, I think, give them the most experience to do the jobs for which they're being selected. I think this is extremely important for the outcomes the public can expect from our government. This issue of conflict of interest is deeply entwined in that. We really should see leaders in our government, whether they're political appointees or career employees, that are ultimately there to enforce or to pursue the rule of law and the interests of the public over any private agenda. And I think that's at jeopardy right now. So the answer is, I am deeply concerned. I think the world we live in today has much bigger, more diverse, and faster moving problems than existed in the 19th century. And therefore, we need a government that is able to respond much more effectively. You do not get that through a spoil system or through a system in which people are loyal above all and all else to the president as opposed to the public's good. And I think that's a existential issue for our country and our democracy. So what happens next, what the Congress ultimately does in pushing back against this, whether the public actually engages and understands what's at stake, these are vital questions for us. I do not want to overlook the fact that we do need real change in our government. I think there is a constructive agenda that would get us better government rather than worse, which is where I think we're heading right now. And we need a public that actually cares enough about this, as they did as you just heard from Ellen, in response to the Gilded Era, in response to the spoils system, a public that cares enough that they're going to actually advocate and agitate for what would be, in fact, better government rather than worse.
When we talk about going back to the future, talk about potentially returning to a spoil system, one thing that comes to my mind is the events that have occurred lately, specifically the wildfires in Southern California, in Los Angeles, and how the incoming president, Donald Trump, has forecasted that he may not give disaster relief to a blue state because of its politics. Ellen, have we seen presidents in the past do that, politicize major disasters because of the politics of a state? Is that more Back to the Future, or is that a new reality with this president?
I have to say, I always hate saying this as a historian, but one must face the facts here that no, I don't think that there are precedents for this. One thing to keep in mind in thinking about this in a broader context is that the presidency was not a terribly important office originally. You remember, as the American Revolution was really a reaction to monarchy and colonialism, and that what we had in the United States for a very long time were presidents whose powers were greatly checked. There was no large federal bureaucracy of the kind that we have today. There were not all of the kinds of civil servants that we have. The agencies that many of them created during the New Deal, all of this post really New Deal and post 1945 government that we now have, and particularly the emphasis on power that is centralized in the White House. That a lot of that is new. But in terms of natural disasters, I think the idea of having that a head of state, that the president himself would use such an occasion to criticize the state leaders that are trying to cope with this catastrophe and so forth. This is not something that I can find a historical precedent for. Perhaps, somebody else can, but I don't see it. I think this is a very extreme and not what other presidents would have viewed as a very statesmanlike response, not in the modern era anyway. I can't think of any similar example. We're not trying to make saints of these prior presidents or to demonize more recent office holders, but it is the case that the whole powers that adhere to the presidency are very different today than they were even 100 years ago. This has changed dramatically in the modern period.
Max, Ellen was just saying that the powers of the presidency have continued to expand. And I think one question a lot of journalists have entering into Donald Trump's second time in office with this current Congress is how much does Congress provide that check and balance as an equal branch of government or not? Do you, Max, see any indication that that lawmakers, especially Republicans in the Senate, will provide any check and balance, or that right now they appear to be ready to go along with much of the president's expanding of his office?
So I think it's a really vital question that you're asking, and one that we'll see played out over the following days, weeks, months, and maybe even years here. Clearly, and again, Ellen is much deeper in this world than I am, but the founders envisioned a government that was supposed to be constrained by separating the powers, the legislative, the executive, and judicial functions. And our history has been one in which, irrespective of party affiliation, the Congress has stood up to executives that they felt were impinging on their authority. I think that has eroded a great deal. And while our system was designed as a separations of power system, and I think equally important, a federal system where you have the federal, state, and local governments, that we have moved in terms of our operations into more of a parliamentary approach where you have the party in Congress following the lead of the if they're in control of the same parties in control of the executive branch, following the lead of the executive branch. And I think that is actually a big problem. We're going to see that firsthand and upfront in the confirmation conversations that are going on right now. Do the senators require that they have access to those FBI background investigations, the certifications from the Office of Government Ethics, that in fact that the people will be able to take the jobs without embodying a real conflict of interest in their actions? But it plays out in many other ways. So I think, I'm not dodging your question. I think this is a really important future focus of the media and the public to see, is Congress standing up? Another area that I think will be very important is to see what happens with the inspector generals across the federal government. And again, a lot of folks may not have deep understanding about what that role is, but post Nixon, there was a lot of effort in building out institutions that would provide oversight of presidential action, and the Office of Government Ethics is an example of that, but also the buildup of these inspector generals that exist in all the major agencies, whose responsibility is to oversee actions and make sure that there isn't violations of law or waste, fraud, and abuse that's taken place. And they kind of have played a dual role of being within the executive branch, but nonetheless reporting to Congress in many ways. Ensuring their independence is going to be important. So those jobs have historically go back to the Reagan administration, not turned over when a new president has come into place. At the back end of the first Trump administration, he actually removed certain inspector generals. I think that's a huge problem. Does Congress stand up to try to prevent that from happening wholesale? I think that will be an important flag for us to be paying attention to. But I think it is going to be vital for Congress to ensure that our rule of law system, our Constitution, is actually being pursued. And again, it's the public's interest rather than a private agenda that is fundamentally the focus of governmental power. That question of using governmental power, again, for the public good rather than the private agenda, I think is at the heart of what we will need to pay attention to and we'll learn a lot about over the course of the next, not just 100 days, but the next 4 years.
If I can interrupt for a moment, Laura, and just on this point that Max is making, it strikes me that, the regulatory state that Franklin Roosevelt's administration helped to put into place is what is in the gun sights, so to speak, of President-elect Trump and his many in his incoming administration. This, of course, was true with President Reagan as well, who was determined to deregulate and to undo some of the measures that were taken to create federal agencies that would oversee elements of government with disinterest in their personal gain and advancing their own economic interests, and were to stand in and represent the people themselves, to look after the social welfare and the well-being of the citizenry. And Reagan, of course, put into positions of power running these agencies people who were not interested actually in enforcing these regulations and really fulfilling the goal of having created them in the first place. So there's a way of rendering these elements of our government that were painstakingly created to ensure this kind of conflict wouldn't exist. They can be undone. And by putting people in place that are actively working against the ideal that had informed their creation of these agencies in the first place. And that, I think, is a matter that should greatly concern Americans, and that people will need to keep their eye out for. I'd also note, just in terms of the 100 days, that when Roosevelt came into office, nobody was denying that he had won the election, and there had been no assault on the Capitol. So there was a country desperate for leadership and ready to allow him to take the kinds of steps that he took, and the Congress, very much deferring to him. And that is a very different moment as well.
Hey, Laura, can I follow suit?
Yeah, jump right in, Max.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, because it's very interesting what Ellen, you just said. And I want to follow up, because in my own head, I see, sort of 3 different buckets that I think are worth focusing on. And one of which you made the analogy to Reagan and the effort to deregulate. There's a certain amount of authority that the executive has to choose discretion in terms of the direction of our government and the policy choices that need to be made. You raise, Ellen, I think, the question about whether that can go too far, whether the actual intent of Congress, which sets up the intent of the agencies that the executive is responsible for leading and actually executing that intent, where they can cross the line and actually undermine that fundamental intent that Congress has set up in the law, creating those entities. And I think that is a fair question to be analyzing. The third piece, which I think is very different and is not mirrored in what happened during the Reagan administration, is this question again, which you allude to, which is it done on the behalf of a view of the public good, a disinterested view of the public good, or of a interested good view and their private interest? And I think what we risk today is a different problem. It can be part of the element of, is congressional intent actually undermined? But layering on top of that is that question about whether the people in charge, from the president to those that he's trying to put in office, are there pursuing the public's interest in a disinterested fashion, or in fact, are they using the power of our government to pursue a private agenda and actually their own interest? That, to me, is back to that question of the 19th century, but in today's world, it's much more profoundly problematic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think we're on the same page on this.
Yeah.
I think these are interrelated problems, but not the same thing.
Yes.
No, but what both of you are talking about makes me think about the nominee to lead the Department of Education, Linda McMahon. And is she going to be actually leading the Department of Education, or tasked with shrinking the Department of Education and what they are responsible for doing? Because Donald Trump has made clear that he doesn't necessarily think that there needs to be a Department of Education, or that the EPA could also, the Environmental Protection Agency, could also be something that needs to be abolished. Ellen, and I'll also ask you this, Max, as kind of, final thoughts for the people watching. Why are the things that we're talking about, the potential impact that Donald Trump may have on government agencies, so important? Why should everyday Americans care? Because I think some everyday Americans may wonder if this actually impacts their day-to-day lives at all.
Well, there was a time, and it was a very, very long time ago, when one could live one's life from birth to death without ever feeling the power of the federal government in your life. That time might as well be, in terms of the arc of American history, the Stone Age. We are touched very profoundly by these decisions that are made in Washington, D.C. And the quality of American life, our coherence as a country, our sense of who we are as a nation, our values, and our economic well-being, our ability to support ourselves and our family, to educate our children, to drink clean water, to be safe in our homes. Look at the Californians who have lost in an instant their homes, their communities. All of these things are very profoundly impacted by the decisions that are made at the national level and the state level as well, and locally. So the day when government doesn't matter, that has a day that is long in our past. And, you know, it is wishful thinking to believe that this will not impact whatever is coming, will not impact in a very direct and immediate way Americans. They will see these, if some of what is being threatened or promised, depending on how you look at it, comes to pass, that will be very obvious. I do think there's an important question here about how the media gets the facts of the matter out, because when Franklin Roosevelt made his fireside chats and spoke to the American people on radio, greatly reassuring them through these years of the Great Depression and through his New Deal activism, that had a powerful and uplifting effect on many Americans. Today, the multiple sources of media and the fact that we are living with the proliferation of so much disinformation, of lies and distortion, this is very concerning in terms of having a stable and reliable truth so that people know exactly what is happening and what isn't happening. But the effects of these kinds of changes that are proposed will be felt very, very quickly, I think.
Max, how about for you? When you're looking at these first 100 days, what has been promised, what has been threatened, as Ellen said, what do you potentially see as something that he may very well actually get done, and the impact that it could have directly on the American people?
So I think that it's maybe not intuitive here, but I think the conversation we just had about the very nature of our government is, in fact, the most fundamental question on the table. Many ways, when you look at federal government activity, it doesn't directly touch the public in all that many ways. It does in some important ways when you fly, and as you heard, the air we breathe, the food we eat, the response to national disasters like we have going on in California. But I think there's a much, much more profound long-term impact that is at play here. We have one tool for collective action as a society that has the imprimatur of the public through elections and taxpayer resources behind it, and that is our federal government. It's actually not in Washington. 80+% of that workforce is dispersed across the country and across the globe. And when we look at the world we're living in, it isn't that 19th century world. The speed of harm can be instantaneous, whether it's pandemics or, again, climate change, or, pick your poison, Russia or competition with China. We live in an enormously dangerous world, and we need that effective public institutional capability that is represented nationally in our federal government to be able to address that world, to keep us safe, which is the most fundamental responsibility of government. So you ask about those first 100 days. I think we need to make sure that we are holding this incoming president, as we would hold any president, to account to be a good steward of what is a public resource, not a private resource, to make sure that it is being used on behalf of the public, not again on for a private agenda, and that is being stewarded effectively so that it's available in an even better form in the future. That better form cannot be returning to the spoil system, but it does require serious changes in how we manage our government. And I hope that whether it's through DOGE or any other efforts, that we actually see, thoughtful, serious efforts to make our government a better place. This will be, I think, a lot of learning that we do really early on. And most important will be the public paying attention and caring and understanding. And I think, as you heard from Ellen, the media's role will be incredibly fundamental to that. There are not only a proliferation of media opportunities, the public has many other opportunities for learning. And I think we all need to take advantage of those and try to make sure that we are, in fact, making the world a better place, for us and for those to come.
I think it's also important to stress and remind everyone the powers of the president are not infinite. He's not an autocrat. He's not a monarch. We don't have a king. And there is no room for tyranny, or there should not be any room for tyranny in the United States. You know, John F. Kennedy in his inaugural famously said, you know, all of this, as he laid out his ideals, his vision for the nation, won't be accomplished in the first 100 days. So he was alive to this promise and said, you know, we may not be able to do it in the first 100 days, the first 1,000 days, or even in the life of the people that were listening to him on that day. And of course, 1,001 day, a little more than 1,000 days later, President Kennedy was dead. He didn't live to realize all of what he had dreamed and hoped for the country. So events have a way of changing what is deemed possible. But in all of this, an engaged citizenry is absolutely vital to what happens, rather than sitting back passively and saying, well, that happens in Washington, it's got nothing to do with me. At the local and state level, it is imperative that citizens remain engaged, that they have good information, and they act on what they see occurring around the country, and indeed it will be seen around the world as well.
Well, I think that we have to leave it there. I know that we at PBS NewsHour are going to be doing what you two just talked about, which is making sure that the public have the facts and the truth, and covering this incoming administration very closely with what ultimately he ends up being able to accomplish or not, and what he's able to do within these first 100 days and beyond. And so it was a very fascinating conversation about the incoming President Donald Trump. And I really appreciate both of your time. Max Stier, CEO of the Partnership for Public Service, and Ellen Fitzpatrick, Professor of History Emerita at the University of New Hampshire. Thank you so much for this discussion.
Thank you.